Hey everybody, welcome back to U.S. Society and Culture. This is going to be our last part on the 1960s. Today we're going to focus on music and counterculture from the era. You already did your music sheet, so you should have a pretty firm understanding of a lot of kind of the stuff we're going to hit today. We'll get right into it then. All right, so first off, we'll talk about counterculture and social movements. I'm also going to include the guided notes for you on the email I'm about to send with a link for this video. That'll give you kind of a firmer understanding of the stuff we're talking about here. Remember, I want to look at those guide notes if and when we get back to school, so that can count towards your participation grade for the fourth quarter to see how well you're listening to all this stuff. So, all right. Okay, so the main the main inflection point or whatever for social movements during the 1960s were college campuses. And I really want you to think about, why are college campuses, even today, such a great spot for these social movements to happen? Okay. Uh, you got young people that are off in college for the first time, able to kind of think for themselves, not kind of stuck to the constraints of living at home with their parents and that sort of thing. So they all come together in college, and we see kind of this big push, this big movement for college age students into getting really engaged and involved in various social movements. What I'm talking about, we're talking about the women's movement, obviously the Vietnam War movement, the civil rights movement, the environmental movement, uh, movements for other minority groups. Later on, you get movements for, gay or LGBT communities and things like that. So, and a lot of this really, really gets going on college campuses. Most notably at Columbia University in New York and the University of California at Berkeley, in California near San Francisco and around there, which was really the epicenter of really the counterculture movement of the 1960s over in California. But also, people kind of underestimate the importance of some of the things that went on the East Coast in places like Columbia University and places like that. So, most notably, we have a lot of these movements that start at Columbia and Cal Berkeley, the Golden Bears. All right, the primary focus was the war, even though, like I said, there was other things too, women's movement, but the biggest one, obviously, were people's opposition to the war. A lot of college students at this time, of course, are in college because it was an alternative to enlisting in the military. Typically, if you were in college, you kind of got yourself out of getting drafted for military service. That wasn't necessarily the case every time, but um, you're probably less likely to be drafted in the service if you enrolled in college during the 1960s. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about kind of the hippie movement. This is kind of interesting because we associate hippies with what we see on television through music and things like that, but the hippie movement was actually a little bit different than what you think. Okay, the foundation of the hippie movement kind of came from the Beat generation of the 1950s. Remember, they were the folks like Jack Kerouac, Allen Ginsberg, and others that um, were frustrated with kind of 1950s society and wanted to just drop out of society and experience their life on their own terms. Uh, so the hippies were kind of similar, but took it to a different extreme. Okay, of course, the early hippie movements really get started in San Francisco, where kind of the first groups got together. There was a bookstore that was owned by a guy named Lawrence Ferlinghetti, who was a member of the Beat generation, and a lot of these young folks in their 20s would congregate there at his bookstore, which I can't was oh, I can't think of what it was called, but anyway, they would congregate there and they would discuss philosophy and things and life in general, and it kind of just snowballed from there into kind of a full-blown movement. Now, again, the hippies that you picture and that we're familiar with socially are not the same as the actual real original hippies. Um, People liked their new and different and earthy style of clothing and dress. So it became kind of a fashion statement. That's really the opposite of what these people wanted. Okay, hippies commonly practiced communal living, where they would go live together in, kind of more rural areas, kind of off by themselves, and would practice some of the things they believed in, such as free love and drug use and things of that nature. One of the interesting thing about hippies, if you want to talk about long-term cultural impact, was their use of more natural foods like granola and yogurt and things like that. It was actually the hippies that popularized yogurt and granola and some other earthier foods that they would generally eat, and they became really popular. And of course, you can get them just about everywhere today. So in these communal living things, these groups would just kind of live together, live off the land, or live a very natural life, um, devoid of kind of some social constraints. Right? They're broken off from society where they can live together and do their drugs or have their discussions or do whatever they were doing. They never intended for their movement to become this big cultural uh, storm of people, wanting to dress like them and wanting to do the things that they did. They didn't expect all the musicians and people like that to um, you know, start practicing the same things that they did. But over time that happened, and that was a result of kind of the lifestyle that these people lived. Okay. Generally, hippies believed in a peaceful existence, right? Uh, a lot of the actions and movements that involved hippies that we see and we think of historically involved episodes of some mild violence or riots or things of that nature. Hippies didn't really want that. The real, true hippies wanted to be kind of, again, away from society, not part of everything that's going on, and want to do their own thing. So, like we mentioned before, and you probably know, the drug culture of the 1960s was largely brought to us by kind of the hippie movement here. So, drug use was very, very high among hippies, and kind of the godfather of the hippie movement was a guy named Dr. Timothy Leary. Timothy Leary was a professor at Harvard, um, and he was kind of the person behind the whole psychedelic drug experience and all that. He actually got fired from Harvard because he was encouraging students to um, use LSD as a way to open their minds to new and different experiences. And like I said, he was kind of like this godfather figure of the whole hippie movement. His famous phrase was um, "turn on, tune in, and drop out." Which could be uh, interpreted in a lot of different ways, but you know, he doesn't want people kind of like the Beat Generation, right? He's telling people that don't be part of society, do your own thing, be your own person. But that can be interpreted also as don't bother with college. It's not necessary. Just go with a free and clear mind and just experience life and enjoy that and that sort of thing. So again, one of the primary figures of this whole movement, Dr. Timothy Leary. Okay. Uh, Probably the largest counterculture movement in U.S. history is the kind of the hippie movement. They bring about obviously changes in terms of what people are eating, through their communal living, granola, yogurt, etc. Uh, but also through how their practices were adapted into music and things of that nature. Their clothing, obviously, their fashion became a really big piece of 1960s culture, wearing clothes with very earthy tones. You got your Birkenstocks and your, um, you know, bigger clothes, and but then you also have the much more colorful tones like tie-dye shirts and things of that nature. So it's very earthy but very colorful as well, uh, which was a big change from the non-offensive, non-confrontational drab clothing that people had always kind of worn before, button-down shirts. This is a big step beyond, the cuffed jeans and the leather jackets and uh, white T-shirts that the teens had worn during the 1950s to show their individuality. So counterculture as a whole, again, very much more widespread than it was during the 1960s, even though it has a lot in common with the Beat Generation movement. This one took on a life of its own, probably in part because it was really popular in colleges, and there are a lot more people in college in the 1960s and 50s. So you got a bigger sample size of people to kind of get into the counterculture movement. So much more widespread than in the 50s. Another thing that helps it spread is that musicians and celebrities of the era would join in on the movements and the ideologies and the protests to make them more popular. Again, we're talking about the influence of the pop culture celebrity and how people want to emulate them and things like that, right? The example of like a John Lennon from the two, very clean cut, more or less, from the first song we listened to on the Ed Sullivan Show to a much more rugged and um, hippie influence look that it was focused on when we saw him singing "Come Together." All right, so let's segue that here just a little bit. You already did your music sheets, so this is, just a little bit of review on that, and then we'll be done with the 1960s. But so music really represents a big part of counterculture during the 1960s. Okay, music uh, really helps it gain steam because the artists believe in what the counterculture folks are believing in. And like we said before, it helps it really become more popular. Okay, so how so? Well, we see a lot of artists make songs that certainly protest the Vietnam War. Fortunate Son would be an example. Songs that protest the Vietnam War or protest other aspects of life, whether it's civil rights. Really, Respect by Aretha Franklin is a bit of a protest song for both the women's movement and for civil rights. And of course, we got an example of a song that focuses on drug use when we listen to White Rabbit by Jefferson Airplane. And, that song basically is about using pills or LSD or something like that and have that psychedelic experience of, you know, this dream style life that comes from being high, apparently. Okay. The big music moment of the 1960s was 1969 at Woodstock. The Woodstock Festival had just about every major American band, save like the Beatles or the Rolling Stones and groups like that. Uh, but just about everybody you can imagine, from Jimi Hendrix to Janis Joplin to Jefferson Airplane, and many others, all appeared and performed at this music festival in Woodstock, New York in 1969. It turned into a bit of a disaster because of the weather and some of the other crazy things that were happening, like um, drug use, of course, and some other promiscuous activities. Uh, and, the concerns about it were big because there was a Rolling Stones concert earlier in earlier in 1969 that the Hell's Angels motorcycle club was hired as bodyguards, and one of them ended up stabbing somebody to death, and it was just a really bad scene. So going into Woodstock, there were a lot of concerns, and but it became, it turned out okay, but did have some problems, but was kind of like one of the key moments of the entire 1960s music movement. And of course, it's talked about more today. When you see like music festivals like today, like Lollapalooza, Lilith Fair, or the Up in Smoke tour, I don't know, any number of things. But Woodstock is kind of like the grandfather of all kind of musical festivals. Coachella, stuff like that. Right. So who are some of the big groups or different styles of music during the 1960s? Okay, so a lot of different genres of music had very big followings. You had the British Invasion groups like the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, and the who I don't have written down there, uh, lead us through the 1960s, and certainly are probably the two biggest bands of the era. Led Zeppelin is another British band. They come around 1968, 69, so we'll actually talk about them more when we get to the 1970s. because they were probably more influential in the 70s. You've got lots of American rock groups, and they represent kind of different genres of music as well. You have people like Janis Joplin and Jimi Hendrix, who are rock stars. Jefferson Airplane, we listen to them. The Byrds, we listen to them. The Beach Boys, particularly, were really popular in the early 1960s, and they were popular for their kind of like surf music and beach music and things of that nature that pre the death of Kennedy was probably, and pre the arrival of the Beatles and the death of Kennedy, kind of all the beach and surf music were probably the most popular rock fad of the early part of the decade. But the Beach Boys obviously were popular throughout the decade and were around quite a while afterwards as well. You also see the emergence of folk music on a more national stage with artists like Bob Dylan and Joan Baez that would, sing usually with very little accompaniment other than their own guitars, and would perform a lot of songs that protested problems in society, from the civil rights movement to Vietnam to, just general issues that, were societal concerns during that time. Okay, and then later in the decade in particular, you had the emergence of Motown. Motown had been around since the late 1950s, but they really catch on during the 1960s with artists like Smokey Robinson and the Miracles, Diana Ross and the Supremes, and then they blow up in 1969 with the arrival of the Jackson 5. Motown was run by a guy named Berry Gordy, Gordy, Berry Gordy, who was the founder of Motown Records. They were out of Detroit, Michigan, and they were probably the first great African American run record company, and they brought a sound, that was popular not only amongst African American audiences but white audiences as well, which is of course is going to be necessary for the growth of their brand and their music. So Motown is extremely influential because it breaks barriers. It's a music that allows people to even more engage with and adopt black musical stylings that before, people had been more hesitant to do or would do it at a much lower scale. It worked with Elvis in the 1980s, but of course Elvis was white, or I'm sorry, in the 1950s, but of course Elvis was white with a African American sound to him a little bit. But this is African American performers. You got the Jackson 5, people like Michael Jackson, Diana Ross, of course, a huge name, and many, many others, Marvin Gaye. So all these performers really go a long way into making African American vocalists and musicians much more generally popular throughout the country, right? So again, you got kind of Diana Ross and the Supremes up here, Jackson 5, the Beatles, Jimi Hendrix, and Janis Joplin, and many other big time artists from the era, but those are the ones that we kind of focused on here. So that'll do it for the 1960s. I'm putting together all my stuff on the 1970s. Hopefully I'll give you another video later this week, and we'll get rolling on that. Hope everybody's well. Talk to you soon.